Hi, my name's Danny Fleming of MA Properties. So the topic I'm going to talk about today is the buyer defaults. Who gets the escrow deposit? It's one of those perennial answers. It depends. It does depend. What do we mean by default? A default is where the buyer is not using a contingency to exit the contract. If a buyer uses a contingency to exit the contract, the buyer gets the deposit. They get that back. Typical contingencies in an offer are an inspection contingency and a mortgage contingency. The inspection contingency is typically always before purchase and sale. Mortgage contingency is always after purchase and sale. There are other contingencies like, subject to the sale of a home, different things like that. But those ones are quite uncommon, depending on the market, of course. But the inspection and the mortgage contingencies are the common ways that a buyer can exit a contract without defaulting. Because if a buyer is using a contingency, they're not defaulting, they're exiting the contract as per contractual agreement. A buyer can default really after there's a key point along the way of offer to closing, which is purchase and sale. And purchase and sale is typically where the balance of a 5% deposit is put down by the buyer and goes into escrow. So you have an inspection contingency, you have a mortgage contingency. The buyer, if they default prior to purchase and sale, is one scenario, and if the buyer defaults after purchase and sale, it's another scenario. And really, those two categories of time are dependent on the amount of deposit that has been put down. If you've got an inspection contingency, if the contract has an inspection contingency and the buyer defaults even before they have an inspection, typically there's $1,000 that's been made at the time of the offer. $1,000 deposit has been provided at the time of the offer, and that's what's at risk if the buyer is defaulting. At purchase and sale is where the buyer puts down the balance of a 5% deposit. That can be a whole lot more money than $1,000. If there's, let's go with $1,000 first. Let's go with $1,000 first. What happens to the money that's in escrow? Well, firstly, the buyer and the seller have to agree to what happens to those funds. The buyer can't unilaterally say, I want the money back, and the seller can't unilaterally say, I want the money back. They both have to agree. Legally, they both have to agree. That's it's written in part of real estate law. They have to agree. Now, if there's $1,000 at risk and the buyer has defaulted, really the seller should get that money, should get that $1,000. Absolutely 100%, the seller should get that money. But the buyer and seller have to agree. At that point in time, the seller's attorney has to get involved and the buyer's attorney has to get involved. They could go back 3 times and still not reach agreement, and the whole $1,000 is already gone with attorney's fees for both sides. So often, it depends on what your seller's attorney recommends, but often sellers' attorneys will recommend to their sellers, it's $1,000, just give it back to the buyers. Just agree to give it back to the buyers. Your call. Sometimes, if there's no inspection contingency prior, with part of the offer, I will ask the buyer's agent for a $10,000 initial deposit for the seller, for the contract. Because did you hear what I just sort of said before? If there's only $1,000 at risk, most of the time the seller's attorneys will say just give the money back. And don't forget, this is for a default. If there's no inspection contingency, there's no contingency that the buyer can use to exit the contract. If they're defaulting between offer time and purchase and sale, they are defaulting. So by asking for a larger initial deposit, we are making the buyer really stop and think about whether they really do want to default on that contract or not. Because often it's just the buyer changing their mind. At that point in time, the seller's attorney will recommend to the seller, yes, let's fight this. They are defaulting. You need to get that money back. Let me try and get that money back for you. You still have to pay the attorney's fees, but you're definitely going to get some of that money back. But again, talk to your attorney. Let's go past the purchase and sale date to closing. If the buyer defaults at that point in time, there's 5% at risk. Now again, they're not, if they exit the contract because of the mortgage contingency, they get the money back. They get the money back. But if they default, then it is the the seller's attorney will absolutely try and get the money to the seller. But again, the buyer and the seller have to agree. Most of the time, the buyer knows if they're defaulting, they're losing their deposit. As sad as that is, doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. But anyway, I hope that made it a little clearer as to what happens when the buyer defaults. If you want more clarification on this or to understand that a little bit better, then please don't hesitate to reach out. My contact information is following, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.